Nicolae Ceausescu. Staying in Bucharest meant losing control of the country. The only way out was by air, and a helicopter was brought to the rooftop of the Central Committee building as crowds gathered below. Ceausescu and his wife were escorted aboard and lifted off above the capital, heading north as protests spread through the streets beneath them. The city fell away quickly. The airspace did not stay open. Within minutes, military authorities ordered all aircraft grounded across Romania. The pilot received instructions that the helicopter could be targeted if it continued flying. Fuel levels were checked. The route ahead narrowed. The aircraft was forced to land in open countryside. They left the helicopter and continued transport by car, passing through rural roads where local units had already switched sides. A military patrol intercepted the vehicle later that afternoon and took both into custody. They were moved to a garrison in Târgoviște and held inside a small military facility under armed guard. 2 days later, an emergency tribunal was assembled inside the building. Charges were read out. The proceedings lasted less than 1 hour. They were taken outside immediately after the verdict. Their hands were bound behind their backs and they were positioned against a wall in the courtyard. 3 soldiers stepped forward with rifles. A firing squad opened fire at close range. He died from multiple gunshot wounds on the spot. Joseph Stalin. Calling for help could cost a career. Inside his private residence at the Kuntsevo Dacha, Stalin had dismissed his staff for the night after an evening gathering with senior officials. The order was clear. He was not to be disturbed until morning unless summoned. The lights stayed on. Hours passed without movement from his quarters. Guards remained stationed outside, waiting for the signal that usually came when he woke. None arrived. By midday the next day, the silence inside had stretched past 12 hours. Still, no one entered. Late in the evening, staff finally opened the door and found him lying on the floor beside a table. One arm was pinned beneath his body. He could not speak. His clothing was damp from where he had remained for hours. Doctors were not called immediately. Medical personnel arrived later and identified a severe cerebral hemorrhage. Breathing grew irregular as his condition deteriorated over the following days. Blood pressure dropped. Paralysis spread along one side of his body. On March 5, 1953, he suffered a final stroke. He died from a brain hemorrhage inside the residence. Muammar Gaddafi. Getting out of Sirte meant crossing open ground with the sky watching. The only way forward was along the coastal highway west of the city, where the terrain flattened into exposed stretches of road with no overhead cover. A convoy formed quickly and moved out together, more than 70 vehicles packed with armed loyalists and equipment, trying to leave the fighting behind before the route closed. Engines stayed high, spacing stayed tight. Dust lifted from the tires as the column pushed across open ground, keeping speed as buildings gave way to scrubland and drainage ditches running beside the road. Radios passed instructions between vehicles, while lookouts scanned the horizon for movement. Then the aircraft appeared overhead. The convoy continued for several more kilometers before the first strike landed near the front of the column. Vehicles were thrown off the road as smoke spread across the highway. A second strike followed minutes later, forcing survivors to abandon what remained and scatter into the surrounding terrain. Gaddafi then moved toward a concrete culvert beneath the road. The opening was less than a meter high. Heat from burning fuel drifted down into the pipe as fighters began closing in from both sides. He was pulled out near the entrance and forced onto the roadside. Militiamen struck him as gunfire continued nearby. A pickup truck arrived minutes later to move him away from the strike zone. He was loaded into the back with visible head wounds as the vehicle drove off toward Misrata. He died from gunshot wounds before reaching the city. Slobodan Milosevic. Remaining in custody meant the trial would decide how he died. You see, inside the detention unit at The Hague, Milosevic was being held while his war crimes trial continued before the International Criminal Tribunal. Court sessions had been suspended several times in the weeks before due to health concerns raised by medical staff monitoring his condition. His blood pressure remained elevated. Daily checks were carried out inside the facility as proceedings were repeatedly delayed. Requests were made for specialized treatment abroad. Those requests were reviewed and denied due to concerns he might not return to custody. He stayed in his cell. On the morning of March 11, 2006, detention officers entered the room and found him lying on his bed, unresponsive. Emergency medical personnel were called in immediately and attempted resuscitation inside the unit. He could not be revived. An autopsy was conducted later that day by Dutch authorities. He died from a heart attack while in detention. Rafael Trujillo. Traveling without an escort left him exposed on the highway. On the night of May 30, 1961, he left San Cristobal in a blue Chevrolet Bel Air and headed towards Ciudad Trujillo along the coastal highway. The road stretched for several kilometers with limited lighting and no escort vehicles ahead of him. The car kept moving north. A group of armed conspirators had already taken positions along the route, waiting near a bend in the road outside the city. Engines were left running as they watched for approaching headlights through the darkness. His vehicle came into view shortly after 9:30 p.m. The attackers pulled out behind him and began firing. Bullets struck the rear of the car, forcing it to slow as tires lost pressure. The driver attempted to maintain control while additional shots hit the side panels and windows. The car came to a stop. Trujillo stepped out onto the roadside as gunfire continued. He was struck multiple times at close range and collapsed beside the vehicle. The shooting lasted less than a minute. He died from gunshot wounds at the scene. Benito Mussolini. Blending into the convoy was the only way north. As German forces withdrew toward the Swiss border in April 1945, Mussolini joined a column of retreating troops moving through northern Italy. He wore a German overcoat and helmet, traveling among military vehicles filled with soldiers attempting to reach the frontier. The convoy did not move unnoticed. Partisan fighters had set up roadblocks along the route near the village of Dongo, stopping vehicles as they passed through the narrow lakeside road. Identification checks began immediately. Passengers were ordered out one by one. He was recognized during the inspection. Mussolini was removed from the convoy and placed under armed guard overnight. The following day, he was transported to a nearby location outside the village of Giulino di Mezzegra and positioned beside a wall along a roadside. Two fighters stepped forward with firearms. Shots were fired at close range. Mussolini was struck several times in the chest and fell at the base of the wall. He died from gunshot wounds at the scene. Pol Pot. The movement he created had already turned against him. Inside Khmer Rouge-controlled territory near the Thai border, internal fighting had broken out between factions as former allies split over leadership. Armed units loyal to rival commanders moved through jungle camps, detaining senior figures who had once operated under Pol Pot's command. He was taken into custody by his own forces. A movement-run tribunal was assembled in July 1997 inside a makeshift clearing where he was placed on trial before members of the organization. The proceedings were brief. He was sentenced to house arrest and moved to a remote compound under guard. Movement was restricted. He remained there for months as conditions inside the camp deteriorated. Food supplies were limited. Medical care was minimal. By April 1998, reports from inside the compound indicated his health had worsened overnight. He was found unresponsive in his sleeping area. A post-mortem examination later reported heart failure. He died in custody inside the camp. Francisco Franco. Letting him die meant ending the regime. Inside Madrid's La Paz hospital, Franco had already been placed under continuous medical supervision as his condition deteriorated in the autumn of 1975. Complications from Parkinson's disease were followed by repeated internal bleeding that required surgical intervention. Blood pressure dropped. Transfusions began. Over the following weeks, doctors performed multiple procedures to stabilize circulation as kidney function declined and breathing became labored. Oxygen support was introduced. Tubes were fitted to maintain respiration, while additional blood transfusions were administered to manage ongoing hemorrhaging. The machines stayed on. His condition worsened through November as organ failure progressed. Cardiac rhythm weakened despite continued intervention from medical staff working inside the intensive care unit. In the early hours of November 20th, 1975, his heart stopped. He died from heart failure after prolonged life support. Saddam Hussein. His final hours were now under state control. Inside the detention facility in Baghdad, Saddam Hussein was removed from his cell in the early hours of December 30th, 2006, and escorted under armed guard toward the execution chamber. The corridor was narrow, concrete walls, fluorescent lights overhead. Footsteps echoed as he walked. A final medical check was carried out inside an adjoining room. His hands were bound behind his back. A black hood was offered and declined. The rope was brought forward. The noose was placed around his neck and tightened beneath the left ear as officials stepped back from the trapdoor. Witnesses stood behind a barrier several meters away as the mechanism was prepared. The lever was pulled. The platform dropped beneath him, and the fall caused a fracture of the cervical spine. He died from a broken neck during the hanging. Adolf Hitler. Being captured would decide how he died. Inside the Führer bunker beneath Berlin, Soviet artillery had already begun landing within range of the government district as streets above filled with rubble and advancing infantry. The underground complex remained sealed, its concrete walls more than 2 meters thick. Meetings continued inside. Staff moved through narrow corridors as final orders were issued and remaining units reported from the outskirts of the city. A cyanide capsule was tested beforehand on his dog inside the bunker to confirm its effectiveness. The result was immediate. Later that afternoon, Hitler withdrew to his private study with Eva Braun. A pistol was carried with him. Those waiting outside reported hearing a gunshot shortly after the door was closed. The room was entered minutes later. He was found seated on a sofa with a gunshot wound to the head, alongside Eva Braun, who had taken cyanide. He died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound.